It was still dark over the North Sea, February 1944. The air was sharp, the horizon invisible. Beneath the wings of a German Heinkel bomber, the water glimmered like black glass. Engines droned in perfect rhythm. Above the roar, the crew heard only the cold wind and their own breathing through oxygen masks. Inside the cramped fuselage, the navigator bent over his chart. He marked their position, confident they were unseen. The Reich had ordered another strike on Britain, a night raid meant to break the enemy's factories before dawn. The pilots believed the clouds would hide them, that the darkness would protect them. But 100 miles away, inside a nondescript bunker on the English coast, a radar screen came alive. Green arcs swept across the glass, painting faint echoes of movement. The operators called out bearings and altitude. The room pulsed with soft light and low voices. Every German aircraft, every turn of its propeller, appeared as a ghostly blip in the glow. Before the bombers even crossed the coastline, Allied interceptors were already climbing to meet them. The battle had begun long before a single shot was fired, not in the sky but on the radar screens that saw through the night. The war of machines had become a war of signals, and the Luftwaffe never realized it was already losing. By 1942, the skies over Europe had become the most complex battlefield in human history. Every mile above the earth was contested. Bombers, fighters, flak, and searchlights tangled in a constant duel for supremacy. Germany's Luftwaffe, once unstoppable, was now being stretched thin. The victories of 1940, Poland, France, the Blitz, had created a dangerous illusion of invincibility. But the tide was turning. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the balance began to shift. American air power arrived with speed, scale, and precision that stunned even their British allies. But behind the roar of engines and the gleam of new aircraft, another weapon was quietly taking shape, one invisible to the eye, yet devastating in its reach. Radar, born from necessity during the dark days of 1940, Britain's chain-home network had saved the island from invasion. Tall masts lined the coast, pulsing radio waves into the sky, detecting German bombers long before they reached the shore. That early warning gave the RAF minutes, sometimes only seconds. But those seconds meant life or death. When American forces arrived in Britain in 1942, they inherited not just airfields and runways, but a mature and highly secret radar infrastructure. The U.S. Army Air Forces immediately began expanding it, improving range, refining resolution, and linking it with mobile ground stations. The British system had been defensive. The American version would become offensive. It wasn't just about seeing the enemy, and it was about controlling them. Each radar beam became a thread in a massive web, stretching from the Irish coast to the French frontier. Every sweep of the antenna fed into operations rooms packed with analysts, radio operators, and intelligence officers. Together they built a living map of the air war. They could trace every flight path, calculate speeds, predict routes, and vector fighters into position long before visual contact. By 1943, the Americans had turned this into an art. Their new SCR-270 and SCR-584 systems could track aircraft hundreds of miles away and even guide anti-aircraft fire automatically. In the fields of East Anglia, massive radar dishes turned silently toward the continent. From their signals, the U.S. 8th Air Force could see formations of German bombers before they even crossed the channel. The Luftwaffe never imagined such precision existed. German reconnaissance relied heavily on spotters and radio intercepts. They believed radar was still primitive, limited to coastal warning and vulnerable to interference. They didn't understand that by 1943, the Americans had fused radar data with electronic warfare and code breaking. Radio beams, encrypted signals, radar returns, all merged into one vast system of awareness. The Allies no longer just reacted to German raids. They anticipated them, and soon every mission the Luftwaffe planned, every takeoff, every formation, would appear as a flicker on a screen deep inside an English bunker. The Germans thought they owned the night. But the night was already taken from them. By early 1944, the radar war had evolved into a silent arms race. The Americans and British no longer viewed radar as a shield. It had become a sword. Allied scientists, engineers, and codebreakers worked around the clock at secret facilities like Bawdsey, Malvern, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory. Their goal was not just to detect the Luftwaffe, but to dominate every wavelength it used. The Luftwaffe's early warning system, known as Freya and Würzburg, had once been considered state-of-the-art. But while Germany's radar network was largely static and limited to defensive coverage, the Allies had transformed their systems into a fully mobile, coordinated grid. They built radar trucks, portable stations, and even ship-mounted units that followed advancing armies across Europe. Each radar pulse could now be linked with fighter command, artillery, and naval intelligence in forming a unified picture of the sky. American operators called it the air plot, a moving, living representation of every friendly and enemy aircraft from the Channel to the Ruhr. At the same time, a second invisible weapon was emerging: electronic countermeasures. Allied aircraft began carrying radar jammers and chaff, codenamed Window, thin strips of aluminum foil that created false echoes on enemy screens. When B-17 or B-24 formations crossed into occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe's radar picture dissolved into chaos. Controllers on the ground could no longer distinguish real bombers from phantom returns. While German operators struggled with the confusion, American radar units quietly watched everything unfold. They could see which airfields scrambled fighters, which sectors panicked, and how radar coverage shifted during an attack. This real-time intelligence allowed the U.S. to adjust flight paths mid-mission, a level of precision the Germans didn't even think possible. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, had become the hunted. From 1943 onward, every major German air operation was shadowed by unseen observers. Whether intercepting U.S. bombers or defending against D-Day reconnaissance flights, the outcome was increasingly determined not by bravery or tactics, but by who knew first. The Americans always knew first. This wasn't luck. It was mathematics, engineering, and discipline. German pilots began to notice strange patterns. Allied interceptors seemed to appear out of nowhere, perfectly timed to their routes. Convoys at sea altered course just before Luftwaffe torpedo bombers arrived. Night fighters scrambled from bases already under pursuit. To the Germans, it looked like coincidence. To Allied radar controllers, it was choreography. And as the war pushed toward 1944, that choreography would decide everything. The skies over Europe were about to become the most meticulously observed space in human history. Every flight plan, every signal, every mistake, and the Luftwaffe's once proud confidence would soon shatter under the weight of an enemy that could see what they could not. In every war, technology changes the rules, but radar changed the very nature of perception. For the men and women who operated it, radar was both a lifeline and a mystery. Inside dimly lit bunkers across Britain, young operators, many barely out of school, stared for hours at green-lit screens. The hum of equipment, the sweep of the cathode ray, and the rhythmic buzz of communication filled the air. They watched shadows move across their scopes and learned to read intent in the flicker of light. A cluster of faint echoes could mean a bomber formation forming up near Bremen. A sudden blur might be a lone fighter climbing to intercept. Every movement, every change in speed told a story. These operators were the unseen eyes of the air war. They never fired a weapon, yet their decisions sent squadrons into combat and saved entire cities from destruction. Few outside their rooms even knew they existed. To them, radar wasn't just equipment, it was intuition honed by hours of observation. The pilots, too, came to depend on these invisible guides. U.S. bomber crews flying into Germany relied on radar navigators to find targets through smoke and cloud. Night fighters, the P-61 Black Widow and British Mosquito, used onboard radar to track enemy aircraft in total darkness. What began as a ground-based system evolved into a partnership between man and machine, an alliance of trust between those who saw and those who acted. Technologically, radar was a triumph of precision. The U.S. SCR-584 could track an aircraft at 40,000 feet with an error margin of less than 200 yards. Its linked computer could automatically direct anti-aircraft guns to fire at predicted points in the sky, turning what was once blind artillery into a mathematical weapon. Mobile versions followed Allied advances, ensuring that wherever the front line moved, radar coverage moved with it. Each blip on a screen represented more than metal and engines. It represented seconds gained, lives preserved, missions redirected before disaster. To the radar teams, it felt like they were not merely watching the war, they were rewriting it in real time. And yet, beyond those silent rooms, their greatest advantage was the enemy's ignorance. The Luftwaffe had radar, but it lacked cohesion. German scientists had created excellent systems, but the military bureaucracy fractured their use. Information from Freya, Würzburg, and Liechtenstein sets often stayed isolated, unshared, uncoordinated. In contrast, American and British systems were built to communicate. Every radar beam became part of a single conversation, a synchronized orchestra of electromagnetic control. The difference was not only technological, it was philosophical. For the Allies, knowledge was a shared weapon. For the Germans, it remained a secret silo, and that difference, invisible on any map, would prove fatal. To the Germans, radar had always been a matter of pride, a scientific tool for defense, not a network for domination. Their engineers, working under immense pressure, developed the Freya early warning radar as early as 1937, and the Würzburg tracking radar shortly thereafter. Both were advanced, accurate, and reliable, yet they suffered from one fatal flaw. They stood alone. Each installation reported to its own command center, its own officers, its own chain of authority. There was no unified system, no central coordination that could turn information into strategy. Even when a Freya detected Allied bombers approaching, that signal often arrived too late, or worse, was lost in bureaucratic confusion. This fragmentation reflected the mindset of the Reich itself. The Luftwaffe, obsessed with honor and instinct, underestimated the power of invisible warfare. To many senior officers, radar was a curiosity, not a decisive weapon. They trusted experience over data, the eyes of pilots over the glow of screens. The result was catastrophic. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Americans embraced the opposite philosophy. For them, technology was not a crutch, it was command itself. Radar data flowed directly from coastal stations to fighter command centers, where it was instantly interpreted and relayed to squadrons in flight. This seamless loop of detection, communication, and interception meant that German aircraft were being tracked from takeoff to landing, without ever realizing it. As 1944 approached, the Luftwaffe's situation grew desperate. Their experienced pilots were dwindling, their factories under constant bombardment. Yet their generals continued to believe that the skies could still be won through courage and maneuver. They did not know that courage could no longer outrun radio waves. The psychological impact of this imbalance was immense. German pilots began to feel hunted, not by aircraft they could see, but by something unseen, something that always seemed to anticipate them. A squadron would take off under cover of night, only to find Allied fighters already waiting at their altitude. Commanders blamed leaks, traitors, or sheer misfortune. Few suspected that the real leak came from the air itself, from the radar echoes bouncing invisibly off their wings. Even at the highest levels, the truth went unrecognized. When reports reached Berlin describing Allied interception accuracy, senior Luftwaffe officers dismissed them as exaggerations. "They cannot see what we cannot," one general remarked. But they could, and they did. In this new kind of warfare, the Germans were fighting blindfolded. Every mission they launched was a conversation the Allies were already listening to, and soon, as 1944's great offensive loomed, that invisible advantage would reveal its full, merciless power, on the day when control of the skies would determine the fate of Europe itself. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke over the English Channel, and the greatest invasion fleet in history began its journey toward Normandy. Operation Overlord, D-Day. The world remembers the beaches, the paratroopers, the landing craft cutting through the surf. But the invasion's success was decided long before a single soldier touched the sand. It was won in silence, through the radar screens that guided, tracked, and blinded an entire enemy air force. In the early hours of that morning, radar stations along the southern English coast hummed with activity. The operators, many of them American, monitored a storm of signals across their scopes. Thousands of aircraft filled the sky. C-47s towing gliders, transport planes carrying paratroopers, fighters providing cover, and bombers striking German defenses inland. To the human eye, it was chaos. To radar, it was orchestration. Every aircraft had a code, a route, a signal. Allied radar networks worked in perfect synchronization. Ground stations tracked takeoffs, monitored altitude, and directed fighters toward any unidentified blip that appeared near the invasion corridor. The U.S. SCR-584 and British GCI, ground-controlled interception systems, worked hand in hand, covering the skies from the Channel to the Cotentin Peninsula. While this invisible web coordinated the Allies, it also deceived the Germans. Operation Bodyguard, the elaborate deception plan, used fake radio transmissions, phantom convoys, and radar-reflecting balloons to convince the Luftwaffe that the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Dozens of radar echoes, created by window chaff and decoy aircraft, flooded German screens. The illusion was perfect. In occupied France, Luftwaffe controllers watched their radar scopes flicker with hundreds of false targets. Reports conflicted, bearings shifted, and entire formations seemed to vanish. Confusion spread up the chain of command. Fighter wings scrambled in the wrong direction, chasing ghosts across the northern coast. When the true invasion began in Normandy, radar silence covered it, not because the Allies lacked coverage, but because they controlled what the Germans could see. Inside one Luftwaffe command bunker near Caen, officers stared at their flickering displays, uncertain which echoes were real. Radio chatter filled the air, scattered, panicked. One operator later recalled, "We saw the sky fill with signals, but we did not know which ones were ours." By the time the first German squadrons reached the coast, Allied fighters were already waiting. American P-51 Mustangs, guided by radar vectors, intercepted them before they even reached the beaches. The Luftwaffe's carefully timed counterattack disintegrated in minutes. What the Germans didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that radar had turned the battle into a map the Allies already owned. Every flight they launched was visible. Every diversion was known. Every shadow was anticipated. As the sun rose higher, thousands of Allied aircraft filled the skies with near-total impunity. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties that day, most intercepted before they ever reached their targets. To the men on the ground, it looked like air superiority. To the radar controllers deep in England, it was proof of something greater: total informational dominance. D-Day was not just the beginning of liberation. It was the moment the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a coordinated force. And from that day on, radar would no longer just detect the enemy, it would dictate the war itself. By the autumn of 1944, the German Air Force was fighting a war it could no longer see. Radar had stripped away its advantage in speed, surprise, and maneuver. Every time a squadron of FW-190s or Me-109s lifted from its airfield, Allied screens across England, France, and Belgium recorded the event within seconds. Analysts could trace their heading, calculate altitude, and even predict targets based on past flight paths. The Luftwaffe's secrets were gone, its wings exposed. The Allies' radar web had grown monstrous. Mobile radar stations rolled ashore with the armies in Normandy, spreading like a second invasion. The SCR-584 and GCI units advanced with each push inland, covering the skies over newly captured territory. From Caen to Antwerp, from Cherbourg to Aachen, a continuous blanket of electromagnetic sight followed the Allies wherever they went. For the Germans, this meant every attempt to strike was preempted. A bomber formation departing from Holland would find interceptors waiting before it crossed the Rhine. Night raids, once used to terrorize advancing, Allied troops were broken apart by radar-guided anti-aircraft fire. Even the feared V-1 flying bombs, Hitler's revenge weapons, were hunted by radar-directed guns and night fighters. By winter, the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death in the air. Its veteran pilots were gone, its replacements barely trained. They flew missions planned with courage but without knowledge, unaware that the Allies tracked them before they left the ground. In October 1944, during the battle for Aachen, American radar stations detected Luftwaffe reinforcements gathering in the Ardennes. Within hours, U.S. fighter bombers struck the airfields, destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground. The Germans never understood how the Allies knew. To them, it was espionage, betrayal, divine luck. They didn't realize it was radar. Cold, mathematical, relentless. Even during the last great German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, radar proved decisive. When dense fog grounded most aircraft, American radar operators guided night fighters through blind skies, vectoring them directly onto enemy formations. As the weather cleared, radar returned to its full power, tracking Luftwaffe sorties as they tried to bomb Allied supply lines. Every attack was intercepted, every formation broken apart. Inside German command bunkers, frustration turned to despair. Reports from the front grew increasingly contradictory. Pilots swore they were ambushed moments after takeoff. Generals demanded explanations. Engineers scrambled to develop countermeasures. Some proposed new radar jammers, others more chaff or tighter radio discipline. But the truth was simple and fatal. They were too late. By 1945, Allied radar networks reached deep into the continent. The air over Germany itself was mapped in real time. The Americans had radar on their ships, in their bombers, on their fighters, and across every captured field. The Luftwaffe's movements were as transparent as ink in water. German commanders began to realize, in quiet horror, that their last remaining strength, air power, had been undone not by bravery or strategy, but by information. And in that realization, the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility finally died. Radar had not just watched the Luftwaffe fall, it had buried it. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the ruins of Germany were not just visible on the ground, they were etched into the air itself. In the days following the surrender, Allied intelligence teams moved swiftly into the remnants of Luftwaffe command centers. What they found confirmed what had long been suspected. The German generals had never truly understood how completely their air force had been watched. Captured logs revealed fragmented communications, inconsistent radar reports, and desperate attempts to locate Allied formations through radio interception alone. In contrast, the Allies had been reading a live map of German movements for nearly 2 years. Every raid, every scramble, every reconnaissance mission had been observed through a veil of radio waves and plotted on massive operations boards. When the surviving Luftwaffe officers were interrogated, many were in disbelief. General Galland, one of the most respected commanders, admitted that the precision of Allied interception had seemed supernatural. Another officer, reviewing post-war records, described it bluntly. They knew where we were before we did. The reality was worse than they imagined. American and British radar operators had not only tracked their aircraft, but also used the data to anticipate replacements, fuel shortages, and flight patterns. By 1944, the Allies could even detect the faint radar emissions from German Würzburg sets, locating and bombing them at will. What had once been a weapon of defense had become a beacon, betraying its own side. The Luftwaffe's fall was not only a failure of machines, it was a failure of belief. The German command had placed faith in valor, in the myth of the ace pilot, in the skill of individuals over the system. The Allies placed faith in science, collaboration, and the invisible logic of data. That contrast, multiplied across thousands of missions, determined who ruled the air. By the time the U.S. 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command launched their final strikes in early 1945, the outcome was predetermined. German radar stations were blinded by jamming. Fighter controllers could no longer separate fact from fiction. American formations flew across Germany almost unchallenged, guided by radar, radio, and mathematics. When peace came, the full extent of Allied radar superiority stunned the world. In declassified briefings, the U.S. and British governments revealed networks so vast and sophisticated that they bordered on science fiction for their time. A radar beam from Norfolk could track a bomber over the Ruhr. A mobile SCR-584 could follow a fighter through cloud cover at night. And for the German generals, reading these reports in captivity, the realization came like an echo. Too late, but undeniable. Every mission they had planned, every maneuver they believed secret, had been watched. Every victory they thought possible was already marked for failure on a glowing screen somewhere in England. The war in the air had not been lost in the skies. It had been lost in the wavelengths between them. After the war, as Europe rebuilt from ashes, the quiet revolution born in radar would reshape the entire world. In the laboratories of Britain and the United States, radar engineers suddenly became heroes of a new kind of warfare, one defined not by trenches or tanks, but by electrons, pulses, and information. What had begun as a desperate British defense measure in 1940 had matured, by 1945 into the foundation of global surveillance. The Americans, recognizing radar's strategic power, immediately integrated it into post-war defense doctrine. The vast network that had once blanketed Europe evolved into new systems designed to watch the entire world. Within a decade, radar chains stretched across the Arctic, the DEW line, scanning for Soviet bombers that might come over the pole. Air defense became not a reaction, but a posture of permanent vigilance. Germany's captured scientists, meanwhile, studied the Allied systems with a mixture of awe and regret. Men who had once directed the Luftwaffe's radar stations found themselves analyzing Allied technology under Allied supervision. They saw the precision, the integration, the cooperation that their own side had lacked. Many of them later admitted that Germany had lost not because it lacked genius, but because it failed to unify it. The radar war also redefined strategy far beyond aviation. It became the foundation for missile guidance, air traffic control, and weather prediction. The very same principles that once tracked bombers over Europe would later guide astronauts into orbit. But for the men who had lived through it, the pilots, operators, and generals, the memory was more personal. To Allied crews, radar was the invisible ally that had watched over them, the calm voice in the chaos. To German veterans, it remained a haunting reminder of how their every move had been seen, their every tactic anticipated. What had once felt like instinct and luck was revealed to have been precision, engineered, measured, and merciless. In post-war debriefings, several German officers expressed disbelief that such a system could exist during their time. One said simply, "We fought ghosts." Another, reflecting years later, called radar the silent front that decided the war. And perhaps that is what radar truly was, the first step into a new kind of combat, one where victory no longer depended on who fired first, but on who knew first. From the ashes of the Luftwaffe's defeat rose a truth that would define the modern age. The greatest weapon of the 20th century was not speed, or armor, or firepower, it was awareness. Radar had seen what courage could not, and in doing so it changed warfare forever. In the quiet that followed the war, the skies over Europe seemed empty, but they were not silent. They still carried the echoes of a struggle fought not with bullets but with knowledge. The story of the radar war was never as visible as the battles it decided. There were no medals for the operators hunched in dim rooms, no glory for the engineers who tuned frequencies until dawn. Yet their work reshaped the boundaries of war itself. It was the first time in history that men could fight, and win, without ever seeing their enemy. For the German generals, that realization came too late. They had believed that warfare was still a matter of steel and courage. But radar had revealed something deeper, that victory belonged not to those who struck hardest, but to those who understood first. Every mission they launched, every formation they ordered, had been illuminated by invisible light. Their defeat was not sudden. It was inevitable. For the Allies, radar became more than a weapon. It was a philosophy, the belief that human perception could be extended, amplified, perfected. It turned uncertainty into clarity, chaos into control. From those glowing green screens came the blueprint for the modern world. Satellites, missiles, global communication, and the unending watch of technology over mankind. In the end, radar did more than win a war. It redefined what it meant to see, and what it meant to be seen. And as the German generals finally understood, long after the fighting stopped, the true battlefield had never been the sky. It had always been the invisible space between,